It isn't unusual for a seller to receive multiple offers in today's market, but even once it settles, once it feels a little bit more conventional, it's still super important for a seller to be able to sit back and analyze the terms of the offer or offers to determine which one is best for them. Because as you're going to see in this video, that yep, the price is super important, but it's not everything. So that's what I want to help sellers with right now, is to help figure that out. And then also some of these expenses or what's normal in an offer might vary from region or state to state or even county to county. So you're going to get a taste of what is normal, although everything's negotiable, but what's normal in my market here in the Sarasota Bradenton area. And this video is also good for buyers because it's good to get into the mindset of a seller to see what they're looking at and thinking about. Hi, I'm Jill Thomas, and each week I bring videos about what it's like to live here in the beautiful Sunshine State, a little bit more about what the Sarasota Bradenton area is like, and then of course I talk about real estate. So if you've been thinking about making a move to here, maybe sadly you're thinking about moving away, or maybe you're already here and you need to move from place to place, then this might be a really good channel for you. So be sure to tap that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and keep on watching. And then when you're ready, give me a call, text, or email me. I'm here to help answer your questions, help you navigate these real estate waters. Of course, there are tons of details that we could dig into when we talk about contracts and these offers, because every property is different, every buyer and seller are different. But in this video, I'm going to cover 7 main components of an offer that a seller needs to think about. And like I said, it's helpful for a buyer to think about too. And then of course, if you're getting multiple offers, you really need to compare and contrast all of these different terms with each other. And when I have a listing and I've received multiple offers, of course, I will send all of the contracts or the offers to the sellers, but then I also create a nice spreadsheet so it helps them to easily analyze what is there, and so they can make the best decisions for themselves. Number 1, purchase price. Of course, this is the first question everybody asks when they get an offer on a property, or even when I'm working with a buyer. How much would you like to offer? And that is huge, of course, but it's not everything, because even if you have an awesome offer for this dollar amount, you got to look at the other terms as well. So even though it might be a really good dollar amount, the other terms make the offer much less appealing, but it's definitely a good starting point. Number 2 is the deposit. So the deposit is the next big thing you need to look at when you're looking at offers. In Florida, usually that deposit is due within 3 days of the effective date, and the effective date of a contract is when all buyers have signed and initialed everything that needs to be taken care of, so we have an executed contract. Now, I've heard from buyers in other states, and they tell me that it's not unusual for a deposit to be just $1,000 to $3,000, even on a $500,000 home. Now, in this market, that really won't fly unless you're getting an FHA loan or a VA loan. And even then, just because of the way the market is today, you're not very competitive with that. So if a buyer is paying cash or getting a conventional loan, 2.5% to 5% of the purchase price is pretty normal for a deposit. And when you're talking multiple offers and you're trying to beat out somebody else, I've seen the numbers go much higher, 10%, 15% even. So keep that in mind, that deposits, it sort of depends on how the market's rolling, but here in this area, you're not going to get away with $1,000 or $2,000 for a deposit. Now, why is this deposit super important to a seller? Because in the end, whatever the buyer puts down for a deposit, it's just going to go into whatever they owe at closing. It's going to help cover closing costs or whatever they're not financing. It's not like it's extra money in the seller's pocket today or anything like that. In the end, the seller's going to get the same amount of money, whether that deposit is 1% of the purchase price or 10% of the purchase price. Well, this is why it is so important, is if a buyer were to walk away from a contract, walk away from a deal where they're not allowed to, maybe, they're outside of the inspection period, the house appraised, there's nothing wrong with the financing, they just want to be done with it. Well, a buyer could more comfortably walk away from $1,000 than they would from $10,000 or $15,000 or $20,000. So you know that you've got a buyer who's serious, they're locked in, they've got some good money on the line, and as a result, that gives the seller a lot more comfort. So number one, let's look at the purchase price. Number two, deposit. If that deposit's not very strong, then most likely you don't have a very strong buyer. Number three, closing date. Now the closing date is part personal preference and part, let's be realistic on the timing of this. The personal preferences, is this something that you can do? Can you get the house packed up and everything squared away that you need to do as a seller before that closing date? Is there something special going on? Because sometimes we'll have a closing date scheduled and then one of the two parties will go, oh wait, I forgot I'm supposed to go to this wedding and these things are going to get, and then we have to push out the closing date or make adjustments. So it's better if you can think all those things through in advance, let the listing agent know so we can set things up for success as early as possible. So that's the practical side. The other side too is, okay, is the buyer getting a loan? Can the lender get the loan closed in that time frame? Because some buyers are trying to be super competitive with their offers right now, and let's say the property is vacant. They think, well, maybe we'll have a shorter time to close and then the seller will like that. Well, that's great, but can the lender really get the property closed in 3 weeks? Sometimes they can, it just depends, but most likely not. They usually need about 30 days or 45 days. It just depends on the lender. So we have to be practical as well. I also try to avoid having closing dates right up against holidays or weekends. So I really don't care to close, plan to close on a Monday or Friday or around major holidays, because if there's a hiccup, there's a little speed bump along the way, then if you're backed up to a holiday, things can get extended longer. It just gets a little frustrating. So keep those things in mind as well. Number 4, financing. Now I could probably make a video all by itself just on this one topic. So we look at, okay, is the buyer paying cash or are they getting financing? If they are financing, what kind of loan? Conventional, FHA, or VA, or sometimes USDA as well. So all those things are super important to look at. If the buyer is getting a mortgage, then that home has to appraise, unless they're gonna waive the appraisal contingency. And if you're not sure what that means, watch just my previous episode from this, number 105, because the whole video was about buyers waiving the appraisal contingency. So let's assume that they're not waiving the appraisal contingency. The house has to appraise for at least the purchase price or more. If it doesn't appraise, then as a seller, most likely the buyer's going to come back to you and say, hey, let's drop the purchase price. Let's renegotiate some of these things. And if the buyer is getting an FHA loan, did you know that the appraised value stays with the house for 6 months? So let's suppose the purchase price is $400,000. The house appraises for $390,000. The FHA buyer says, I can't do that. They walk away. That $390,000 number is now stuck with your house. So you either need to A, find a cash buyer, or B, find somebody who's going to get a conventional loan and they're willing to pay that difference, the $10,000 or plus, because maybe now that conventional buyer says, oh, I'm going to buy the house for $405,000. I'm happy to do that. Well, they need to bring $15,000 extra to closing, cover that appraisal gap. So even though they're not getting an FHA loan. So there's a lot of things to think about with the financing. So think that through, talk about it with your agent, the listing agent. Now, if the buyer is getting financing, then they should be submitting a pre-approval letter with a lender when they submit the offer. When they do that, your listing agent should be calling that lender and saying, hey, let's talk about these buyers. Are they solid? Do they have wiggle room? And not so much that you want to pull up the purchase price, but are they at the top of their budget? Is this a comfortable level for them? Because obviously that lender is not going to give you personal, private information about their finances, but you want to have that solid conversation with them. Was the lender even responsive? Do they seem like a decent person? Because if they're going to be difficult when you just ask them basic questions before you're under contract, what are they going to be like after you're under contract? Those could be red flags. So it's really important for the listing agent to have a good conversation with the lender before the seller signs that offer. And then if the buyer is waiving the appraisal contingency, ask the lender, hey, do you know that that's what they want to do? Do they have the funds available to make up that difference in addition to everything they need to close? Because if they go, oh, they're doing that, then that's not going to work out. So the financing segment, portion of the offer is really important to look at. And there's a little bit of background, digging that we need to do to make sure that that's a good buyer for you. Now, just because somebody's getting financing or getting an FHA loan doesn't mean that they're not a good buyer or a good contender. We just have to do a little bit of homework, and that's okay. One final thing about financing is if the lender is local, that's really good. I prefer to work with a local lender than somebody from a big bank or, like a 1-800.com type lender, because they're here, they're local. Usually they will answer their phones in the evenings. If there's a hiccup along the way, they're ready and willing to jump in and help out. So I much prefer to work with a local lender than somebody who's out of the state. Number 5, inspections. So the next big thing, especially in the state of Florida, because of how our contracts are written for a seller to look at, are those inspections. Now in Florida, we have 2 main contracts that a buyer can use. And the difference between those 2 contracts has everything to do with inspections. The first type of contract is the as-is contract. We say that the buyer is purchasing the property as is with the right to inspect. So buyer can have any inspections they want on the property during that inspection period. And then they can either move forward with the purchase or they can walk away and get their deposit money back. So that's legitimate. They're allowed to do that. As a seller, you are not contractually obligated to make any repairs, but it is not uncommon in our area for a buyer to throw something out to a seller and say, hey, listen, I'm good with everything. I'm good with all these little Mickey Mouse things, but there's a roof leak. I would like you to fix that. These windows aren't functioning. I'd like you to fix that. The pool pump isn't working. I would like you to fix that. Especially if these things weren't disclosed, maybe the seller's not even aware that these things aren't functioning, then it's not unusual for a buyer to ask a seller to do that. Now, a seller can say no, but if the buyer gets out of the deal, they walk away, now the seller has to disclose all of those things that they found out about the property to future buyers. And as a licensee, as a licensed agent, I can't hide those things either. So even if a seller goes, hey, we don't need to tell them about those things, it's not that big of a deal. Yes, we do. So we do have to disclose those things to potential buyers. So there's pros and cons to that as is contract. And I will say that's used most of the time in our area. The second type of contract is what I refer to as a standard contract, where the seller does have to make repairs. So what happens in this contract is upfront, buyer and seller negotiate how much the seller could spend on repairs to get the house to remedy anything that we found during the inspection period. And this could either be a flat dollar amount or a percentage of the purchase price. So let's say they go, okay, seller will make repairs up to $4,000. Well, we get the inspection report from the buyer, and really the buyer needs to put on notice what things they would like to have repaired. And then you have to make those repairs up to $4,000. Now, these things are only for warrantable items, not cosmetic. So warrantable, we're talking about electric, plumbing, roof, AC, the windows, things associated with the swimming pool. Everything should be functioning the way it's meant to function, but it doesn't cover things that are cosmetic. Cosmetic would be like cracked tiles, ripped screens, believe it or not, holes in the wall. That's considered cosmetic. So the seller's only obligated to make repairs to the warrantable items up to that dollar amount. Now, as a seller, if you have a preference between the as-is contract or the other contract, the standard contract with repair limits, then upfront the property can be marketed and the listing agent can put in the MLS so the other agents see that seller's only accepting as-is contracts. Seller does not want as-is contracts. It's not being sold as is. So you can kind of take control of that upfront if you want. A lot of times sellers will say, just tell buyers to bring offers and I'll take a look at it. But it's good for you to be aware of what are the differences between our 2 contracts in regards to inspections. Number 6, closing costs. Now, typically in our area, the buyer chooses the closing agent, whether it's a title company or an attorney, to handle the closing, do all the titles work and everything, take care of all of that. So the buyer chooses it, the buyer pays for it. But certainly these things can be negotiated. And actually historically in Manatee County, sometimes it was more common for the seller to do it, but with the way the market's been recently, the buyers have been doing it pretty much across the board. Now, if a seller wants to pay for that and be in control of the closing and have that attorney take care of everything on their behalf, they can certainly do that. It's not that you can't do it, but typically the buyer will do that. So you want to look to see, okay, is the buyer saying they're going to do it, or do they expect the seller to do it? Also, sometimes a buyer might say, well, I'm going to pick and pay, but I still want maybe the seller to credit back a certain dollar amount or percentage at closing to help cover those closing costs. You'll see that a lot more with an FHA loan or a VA loan. Not always, but even sometimes with a conventional loan. In the past, I've seen that where the buyer says, okay, well, I'm going to pay for all this stuff, but I still want like a $2,000 credit from the seller to help go towards the closing costs. So it's definitely a mixed bag of different options and ways that can be set up. Currently, right now, it's pretty black and white, it's pretty straightforward. But as we move forward, as the market starts to shift again, we might see some different things. So that's really important for you to take a look at and notice, okay, what is the buyer asking from me, the seller, to take care of closing costs? Number 7, the fine print. Okay, so this one's just sort of a catch-all of a lot of random things that can happen. So in a contract, you have to watch because buyers might ask for certain things, and depending on what line that the buyer's agent sticks it on, sometimes they're harder to see than others. We do have a big blank section that extra terms can be written in, but sometimes there's all these other little random lines that they'll try to squeeze things in. So some things that a buyer might ask a seller for at closing might be extra appliances. Let's say there's a refrigerator in the garage and they want that. Let's say they want the TVs or certain pieces of furniture. That's not uncommon. Maybe they want the seller to make certain repairs up front before they even have inspections, especially for those cosmetic things. My first listing was my parents' house, and there were some general cracks in the driveway. They weren't bad, and the buyer asked for them to repair those. My parents said no, the buyer still bought. Now, let's suppose there is something cosmetic that's pretty significant that you want the seller to fix because you know that no matter what, that's not going to fall underneath those repairs. It's not a warrantable item. Like there is a hole in the wall for some reason, or there's a majorly damaged door, and it's just on the face of the door. You can put that in the contract and say that the buyer would like the seller to have that hole patched and the texture to kind of match, and for them to paint the wall and touch that up so it looks a little bit more flawless than what it does currently. So sometimes a buyer will ask for some of those repairs up front in the contract. A buyer might ask for the seller to pay for a home warranty, and that's not insurance. It's not homeowner's insurance. Sometimes people get confused with that, but for a home warranty. Something else a buyer might ask a seller to do is remove some older items, like maybe there's an old shed in the backyard or a swing set, whether it's a nice swing set or a old swing set. Maybe they just don't want it, and they say, okay, we want the seller to remove those things. So those are some other details we need to look for. And then sometimes I've heard of super random things being requested, like maybe the buyer wants the seller's cat or dog or a boat or a car or a golf cart or something like that. So sometimes those things can be incorporated into a contract. Now, some of those major things like that, if a buyer is getting a loan, we have to deal with those things a little bit differently. You just can't throw that into the purchase price, So if you want the golf cart to be included in the purchase, and initially the offer would have been $400, and they go, well, I want $408 now because of the golf cart. We have to be careful with those numbers and how we present that, because otherwise the underwriters from the lender won't like that. So we have to be smart as we approach some of those unique and creative requests in a contract. So as you can see, even an offer with a really awesome, strong purchase price could be soured based on other terms that are in the offers. So that's why it's so important for the seller to step back and look at everything, just not the purchase price. And then as a listing agent, I'm here to help do some homework, whether it's calling the lender, having a better conversation with the buyer's agent, maybe doing some other background, digging in on some different things. Because like I said before, every house is different, every buyer is different, every seller is different. So I'm here to help. So we want to have as smooth of a transaction as possible. Let's try to eliminate some of those headaches, some of those little potholes, if you will, in advance. And then that is what really helps make for a nice transaction. In the end, it's been my experience that really the most simple offer with the least amount of risk is the best for the seller. But in the end, it's up to you as the seller to decide which offer you'd like to go with, or which terms you would like to counter and try to negotiate a little differently for yourself. So we can do that too. I didn't really mention much about going back and forth in those negotiations, but that's certainly an option as well. So what did you think? Did I miss out on anything that was super important? The offer process? No, like I said before, things might be different in a state that you're in, and maybe it's something that we don't address here, or, there's just so many different factors involved. But if there's something I forgot to mention, please put that in the comments below, and I'd be happy to address those with you. And of course, if you have any questions, please give me a call. I'm here to help. Thanks so much, guys. Have a great day.